The sun was setting over the wide plains of Montana, bleeding gold and crimson into the endless sky. Dust rose from the hooves of horses as the annual Harvest Rodeo Bash came alive with laughter, music, and pride. Cowboys from all over the state had gathered, each boasting about their skills, their winnings, and their charm with the ladies. But in that crowd stood one man who didn't boast, didn't laugh, and didn't need to. His name was Colt Maddox, a tall, rugged cowboy whose quietness spoke louder than any brag. He was the kind of man whose eyes carried both the weight of loss and the strength of endurance. People whispered about him. Some said he'd lost his fiancée years ago to a ranch accident. Others said he'd left town to escape his own guilt. But tonight, he was back. And people noticed. A group of ranch hands leaned against the corral fence, bottles in hand, grinning as they spotted him. One of them, Tucker Reed, the loudest and meanest of the bunch, smirked and nudged his friends. Well, if it ain't Colt Maddox, the cowboy who thinks he's too good for a laugh. Come on, Maddox, lighten up. Pick yourself a girl tonight. The fair's full of 'em. Colt didn't answer. He leaned on the wooden fence, eyes scanning the crowd, not with hunger but with distance. Tucker pushed on, sensing blood. Tell you what, Maddox, since you're too shy to find yourself some company, we'll help you out. Pick any girl you want. Go on, show us that cowboy charm. The group laughed, their voices echoing into the cool evening air. But then the laughter died as Colt finally turned. His gaze swept the fairgrounds and landed on the far side of the dance floor, where a small group of women stood near the lemonade stand. Among them was one woman the crowd rarely noticed, Clara Mayfield. She wasn't the dainty, giggling type the others were. She was broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a strength earned from years of working her family's failing ranch. Her dress didn't shimmer like the others, and her boots were worn at the heel. The other girls whispered about her often, not out of kindness. She's too big for her own good. She could never keep up with a man like Colt. She's better suited to lifting hay than dancing. But Clara never seemed to care. She carried herself with a quiet pride, her chin high, her eyes steady. Colt raised a calloused hand and pointed toward her. His voice was calm, but it cut through the laughter like a blade. Her, he said, the one you call too big. Silence fell over the group. Tucker blinked, thinking he'd misheard. You're joking, right? Her? Colt's eyes didn't waver. That's right. Her. The men burst into laughter again, but this time there was a nervous edge to it. They had expected Colt to pick one of the prettiest girls in the crowd, maybe to prove himself or to join in their mockery. Instead, he'd turned their cruelty on its head. Colt walked across the dance floor with long, unhurried strides. The crowd parted a little, whispers chasing him like wind. When he reached Clara, she turned, her brows knitting in confusion. "Evening, ma'am," Colt said, tipping his hat. "Would you mind if I asked for this dance?" Clara blinked, her cheeks flushing. She wasn't used to being asked, especially not by a man like him. I don't think I'm your kind of dance partner, Mr. Maddox." He smiled softly. "You'd be surprised what kind of partner I'm looking for." For a heartbeat, the music seemed to pause, then swell again. Slowly, Clara placed her rough hand in his. The people watching expected him to hesitate, but he didn't. He guided her gently to the center of the dance floor as the fiddlers struck up a slow, sweet tune. Around them, eyes watched, whispers hissed. "She's too heavy on her feet. He's just doing it for a laugh. He'll regret it." But Colt didn't seem to hear them. As they began to move, something quiet and powerful filled the space between them. Clara's steps were uncertain at first, but Colt's calm strength steadied her. Soon she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in years. And Colt? He looked at her as if the noise, the lights, and the cruel laughter had all melted away. When the music ended, the crowd expected him to step back, bow politely, and walk off. Instead, Colt kept holding her hand. He turned to the stunned onlookers and said evenly, "You boys ever stop to think that the strongest hearts don't fit your small minds?" Then he nodded politely to Clara and walked her off the dance floor, leaving a silence that spoke louder than the laughter ever had. Behind them, Tucker muttered something under his breath, but his friends didn't laugh this time. They just watched, The kind of watch that meant something had shifted, though they couldn't say what. And from that night on, folks in town started to talk, not about Clara's size, but about the cowboy who chose her in front of everyone and never once looked back. The morning after the rodeo, the small town of Willow Creek buzzed like a hive shaken by a stick. Folks at the diner couldn't stop whispering about what Colt Maddox had done. Some called it chivalry, others said it was pity, but most just didn't understand. Clara Mayfield tried to push the gossip from her mind as she worked her father's ranch. The wind carried faint echoes of laughter from town, but she kept her eyes on the herd, her hands on the rope. Her father, old Ben Mayfield, watched her from the porch with weary eyes. "Clara," he called out after a while, "you best come inside. There's a storm brewing, and I don't mean just the clouds." She wiped her hands on her apron, squinting toward the horizon. The sky was bruised with dark grey clouds rolling in fast from the west, but she knew her father wasn't just talking about weather. Inside, he sat her down at the table. "I heard what happened at the rodeo," he said carefully. "Colt Maddox asking you to dance." Clara looked away. "Wasn't much of a dance. Folks just made more of it than—" "It was," Ben sighed. "That man's got a reputation. Folks talk. I don't want you hurtin' when their laughter fades." She frowned. "You think I don't know what they're saying? I've heard it all my life. Too big. Too rough. Not a real lady. But when he looked at me last night, Pa, I didn't feel like the joke anymore." The old man nodded slowly. "Then maybe for once you deserve to feel that." Down in town, Colt stood outside the blacksmith's shop, oiling his saddle and ignoring the sideways glances. Tucker Reed and his gang had made sure the story spread faster than wildfire. "Well, if it ain't the gallant hero," Tucker drawled, swaggering up. "How's the big gal treating you, Maddox? Hope she didn't crush your boots when you danced." Colt's hand tightened on the rag, but he didn't turn. "Careful, Tucker," he said quietly. "You're talking too loud for a man who's never done one decent thing in his life." Tucker smirked, circling him. "You think picking the biggest woman in town makes you noble? You just wanted attention, that's all." Colt stood, his height and calm presence suddenly making Tucker step back. "What I wanted," Colt said evenly, "was to remind people that worth don't come wrapped in pretty ribbons. And if you can't see that, then you're smaller than I thought." With that, he walked off, boots striking the dirt like thunder. Tucker watched him go, his pride burning. That afternoon, the storm broke loose. Wind howled across the valley, rattling fences and slamming shutters. Clara fought to bring the cattle in, her hair whipping across her face, mud splattering her boots. Lightning flashed, and one of the young calves bolted toward the river bend. Without thinking, Clara chased after it, her lungs burning as rain lashed her face. The river was swelling fast, its current growing deadly. She caught the calf's rope just as her boots slipped on the wet bank. With a cry, she tumbled into the freezing water. Back in town, Colt had just stepped out of the saloon when he heard the thunder and the faint sound of someone shouting near the river. He didn't think twice. He grabbed his horse, Dusty, and galloped through the rain, following the desperate cries until he saw her, Clara, clinging to a branch, the river tearing at her legs. "Clara!" he shouted, jumping from the saddle. "Colt!" Her voice cracked with fear. He waded into the current, each step a battle. The water slammed against him, but he pushed through until he reached her. "Hold on, I can't." "Yes, you can," he growled, gripping her arm. "I've got you." With every ounce of strength, he pulled her free and dragged her onto the muddy bank. They collapsed in the rain, gasping for breath, water streaming off them both. For a long moment, they just lay there, listening to the storm. Then Colt turned to her, brushing wet hair from her face. "You could have died out here," he said softly. "So could you," she whispered back. He smiled faintly. "Then I guess that makes us even." Her eyes glistened. "Why'd you do it, Colt? Why'd you pick me that night?" He looked at her then, not just at her face but into her eyes, like he was searching for something deeper than beauty. "Because when the rest of the world was laughing, you weren't. You've carried more weight than most men ever could, and you never asked for pity. I didn't pick you out of charity, Clara. I picked you because you're the only one strong enough to stand beside me." The storm raged around them, but in that moment neither of them cared. She swallowed hard. "They'll talk even more now. "Let 'em talk," he said, pulling off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. "This world's too full of people who speak before they understand. I'd rather stand in the storm with someone real than dance in the sunshine with someone hollow." She looked down, tears mixing with rain. "You don't know what that means to me." He smiled, his thumb brushing a drop from her cheek. "I reckon I do." The next morning, the storm had passed. The air was fresh and the town was quiet for once. When Colt rode into the square, he had Clara riding beside him, head held high, hair tied back, eyes steady. Whispers started again, but this time something was different. Maybe it was the way Colt rode so close to her, or the way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the world worth looking at. He dismounted in front of Tucker and the same men who had mocked him before. The silence was thick. "You still laughing, Tucker?" Colt asked. Tucker tried to speak, but no words came. "That's what I thought." Colt tipped his hat, turned to Clara and offered his arm. "Come on, ma'am, I promised you breakfast." As they walked away, the whispers faded, not because people stopped talking, but because shame had stolen their words. And from that day on, in a small Montana town where appearances once ruled, folks began to remember something Colt Maddox had proven with a single act of courage. That real love ain't measured by what the world sees, but by what the heart knows.